remember the moment like it just happened. My name's Maya. I'm 32, and honestly, I don't know what I was thinking. We were sitting on the couch in my apartment, legs casually tangled together, the soft hum of the TV in the background. Chris had just made one of his sarcastic remarks, something about how I could never decide where to order takeout from, and I'd shot back with a laugh. "You're lucky you're even my side piece." It wasn't the first time I'd said something like that. We had that kind of banter, playful and teasing, or at least that's what I thought. But this time, instead of smirking or rolling his eyes, he just went quiet. The silence stretched, and I felt it settle between us, heavier than it should have been. At first, I didn't think much of it. Chris was thoughtful, the kind of guy who paused before speaking, like he wanted to make sure his words were worth saying. But then he looked at me, not angry, not hurt, just searching. "Is that how you really see me?" he asked, his voice calm, too calm. My stomach twisted. I opened my mouth to brush it off, to say something light and clever, but nothing came. I wasn't prepared for that question. It wasn't supposed to be serious. None of this was supposed to be serious. I shrugged, trying to laugh, but the sound felt thin. "Come on, Chris, it was a joke. You know I didn't mean it." He didn't smile. He didn't look away, either. "But do you mean it, though?" he pressed. "Even a little?" The weight of his gaze pinned me in place. For the first time, in the 2 years we'd been together, I felt like I couldn't hide behind humor or sarcasm, and I hated it. "Where's this coming from?" I asked, deflecting, hoping to shift the focus off me. His eyes flicked down for a moment, and he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Maya, you joke about this stuff all the time, and I laugh it off because I know you're not the mushy type. But..." He trailed off, and I felt my chest tighten. "But what?" I pushed, my voice sharper than I intended. I didn't like where this was going. I didn't like feeling like I'd done something wrong when I didn't even understand what it was. He leaned back against the couch, crossing his arms. "But sometimes it feels like you're not even sure about us, like you're keeping me at arm's length just in case." I blinked, stunned. Chris wasn't the type to throw out accusations or make a scene. He was steady, patient, the kind of person who balanced out my chaotic energy. And maybe that was the problem. I wasn't used to being with someone like him, someone who cared enough to call me out. "That's not fair," I said, defensive now. "I've been here, haven't I? I've shown up for you. For us." My voice cracked slightly, and I hated how vulnerable I sounded. He didn't respond right away, just watched me with those unreadable eyes. "Yeah," he said finally. "You've been here, physically. But emotionally? I don't know, Maya. Sometimes it feels like you're halfway out the door." The words hit harder than I expected. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that I wasn't like that. But deep down, I knew he wasn't entirely off the mark. I'd always been the one to keep things light, to avoid the messy, complicated stuff. It was easier that way. Safer. But Chris wasn't like the others. He wasn't content with just the surface-level version of me, and I didn't know how to deal with that. I looked away, focusing on the flickering light of the TV. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way," I said softly, barely above a whisper. "I guess I don't always know how to show what I'm feeling." It was as close to an admission as I could manage, and it felt like I was handing him a piece of myself I wasn't sure I wanted to share. Chris nodded slowly, his expression softening, but not entirely. "I get that," he said. "But it's hard, Maya. It's hard to feel like I'm the only one taking this seriously." His words hung in the air, and I felt something shift inside me, a crack in the armor I'd spent years building. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I cared more than he realized. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I knew how to show it. And maybe, just maybe, I was afraid to. Chris reached for the remote, turning off the TV. The sudden silence was deafening. "We should talk," he said, his tone gentle but firm. My heart sank. I hated those words. They never led anywhere good. But the look in his eyes told me this wasn't something I could joke my way out of. Not this time. I sat there, gripping the edge of the couch cushion like it could anchor me against the tide I felt coming. Chris turned to face me fully, his expression steady but unreadable. My heart pounded in my chest, a sharp rhythm that made it hard to think clearly. "What is there to talk about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even, but it wavered just enough to betray me. He exhaled, the kind of sigh that seemed to carry more than just breath. "I need to know where we stand, Maya. Really stand." His tone wasn't accusatory. It wasn't angry. That somehow made it worse. If he'd yelled or gotten defensive, I could have matched him. But this quiet, thoughtful approach left me with nowhere to hide. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know how. So instead, I looked at him. Really looked at him. For what felt like the first time in weeks. His dark eyes, usually filled with patience, held something different now. Uncertainty. And hurt. My chest tightened at the sight. I hadn't meant to make him feel like this. I hadn't even realized I was. "I thought we were fine," I said finally. And even as the words left my mouth, I knew how hollow they sounded. Chris raised an eyebrow, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Have you? Or have you just been telling yourself that so you don't have to dig deeper?" The words stung. I opened my mouth to fire back, to defend myself, but nothing came. Because he wasn't wrong. I'd been skating on the surface of our relationship, avoiding the deeper waters because they terrified me, and now it was catching up to me. "I don't know what you want me to say," I admitted, my voice quieter now. Vulnerability wasn't something I was used to showing, even with him. Especially with him. Chris leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he studied me. "I want you to be honest," he said simply. "With me, and with yourself." That hit harder than I expected. I looked away, my gaze drifting to the coffee table, where an empty glass sat next to a stack of unopened mail. It felt like the room was closing in on me, the walls pressing closer with every second of silence. "I am being honest," I said, though even I could hear the defensiveness in my tone. I don't know how to do this." Chris tilted, his head, his expression softening just slightly. "Do what?" he asked, his voice gentle now. "Talk? Be in a relationship? Care?" That last word hit like a sucker punch, and I flinched before I could stop myself. "Of course I care," I said sharply, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "You think I don't? That's not fair, Chris." My voice cracked on his name, and I hated the way it made me feel exposed. "I didn't say you don't care," he replied calmly. "I said it doesn't always feel like you do. There's a difference." His words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. And for once, I didn't have a snappy comeback. Because deep down, I knew there was truth in what he was saying. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I've never been good at this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "At letting people in. At being vulnerable." The words felt foreign in my mouth, like they didn't belong to me. But they were the truth, and saying them out loud felt both terrifying and freeing. Chris nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "I get that," he said softly. "But I can't be the only one putting in the effort, Maya. I can't be the only one taking the risks. Relationships don't work like that." His words weren't harsh, but they carried a weight that settled deep in my chest. I swallowed, hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult. "I don't want to lose you," I said finally, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. It was the closest thing to a confession I'd ever made, and it left me feeling raw and exposed. Chris's expression softened, but he didn't move closer. He didn't say anything right away, and the silence that followed felt like it might crush me. "I don't want to lose you either," he said eventually. "But I need to know that you're in this with me, really in it, because I can't keep wondering if I'm just waiting for you to leave." His voice was steady, but I could hear the pain beneath it, and it broke something inside me. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if there was anything I could say that would make this better. All I knew was that I didn't want to lose him, but I wasn't sure if I knew how to keep him either. And that realization scared me more than anything. The silence between us stretched, filling the room with a tension I didn't know how to break. Chris was still sitting there, waiting for something, an answer, an explanation, anything that might make sense of what I just said. But I didn't have the words. All I could feel was the weight of his hurt, his frustration, and the undeniable truth that I'd put it there. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, struggling against the knot in my throat. "I don't know how to do this," I said again, softer this time, as if saying it more quietly might make it less pathetic. "I don't know how to be what you need." Chris sighed, leaning back against the couch. He looked exhausted, like this conversation was taking something out of him that he wasn't sure he could afford to lose. "I don't need you to be perfect, Maya," he said after a moment. "I just need you to try, to show me that this, us, matters to you." "It does," I said quickly. The words rushed out, desperate and unsteady, but true. "You matter to me, Chris. You do. I stopped, shaking my head as my voice caught. "I'm scared, okay? I don't want to mess this up. I don't want to get hurt." There, it was. The thing I'd been dancing around for weeks, maybe months. The fear I'd buried under layers of jokes and deflections. And now that it was out there, I felt exposed, like I'd just handed him a piece of myself I wasn't sure he wanted. Chris looked at me, his expression softening but still cautious. "You think you're the only one who's scared?" he asked, quietly. "You think I don't worry about getting hurt too? About losing you?" I blinked, caught off guard by the vulnerability in his voice. Chris wasn't the type to wear his heart on his sleeve, but right now, he was laying it all out. There, and it hit me how much I'd underestimated him, how much I'd taken for granted. "I guess I just thought you'd always be here," I admitted, the words tasting bitter as they left my mouth. "I didn't think I could lose you." He gave a small, sad smile. "Maya, I've always been here, but that doesn't mean I always will be." The weight of his words settled over me, and for the first time, I felt the true scope of what was at stake. Chris wasn't threatening me or giving me an ultimatum. He was just being honest. And that honesty was more terrifying than anything else. "I don't want to lose you," I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then show me," he replied. "Show me that you want this, that you're willing to put in the work, because I can't keep doing this alone, Maya. I can't keep feeling like I'm the only one who cares." His words cut deep, but they also lit a fire in me. A desperate need to prove to him, to myself, that I could do this, that I could be the person he needed me to be. "I will," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "I don't know how, but I'll figure it out. I'll try, Chris. I swear I'll try." He nodded slowly, his eyes searching mine for a long moment. "Okay," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. Then let's figure it out. Together. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with uncertainty. I knew this wasn't the end of the conversation, not by a long shot, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. Chris leaned back into the couch, his arms crossed. And though his body seemed more relaxed, the tension between us lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that his words were still hanging in the air, like they were waiting for me to fully absorb them. What does trying look like to you? I asked softly, my fingers twisting the hem of my shirt. Chris hesitated, his eyes drifting to the blank TV screen, as if he was searching for the right words. It's not about some grand gesture or fixing everything overnight, he said eventually. It's about showing up, about being honest, and not just when you think it's convenient. My stomach twisted at that last part, but I nodded, my gaze fixed on my hands. Okay, I murmured, though the word felt small, inadequate. No, Chris said, his tone firm but not unkind. Not okay. I don't want you to just agree with me because it's what I want to hear. I need you to really think about this. About us. The knot in my throat tightened, and I felt a flicker of defensiveness rise up again. Do you think I don't think about us? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. You don't think I wonder every day if I'm good enough for this? For you? Chris turned to look at me, his brow furrowed. Maya, this isn't about whether you're good enough. That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? I snapped, frustration bubbling to the surface. That I'm not doing enough? That I'm the reason things aren't working? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not blaming you, he said evenly. I'm asking you to meet me halfway. That's all I want. The anger drained out of me as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a hollow ache. I pressed my palms against my knees, trying to ground myself. I'm scared, I said again, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I don't know if I know how to be what you need. Chris's expression softened, and he reached out, his hand resting lightly on mine. You don't have to have it all figured out, he said. I don't either, but we have to try, Maya. We have to stop hiding behind jokes and sarcasm and actually talk to each other. That's how this works. The simplicity of his words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't some impossible standard he was asking for. Just honesty, effort, a willingness to be vulnerable. And yet, it felt like the hardest thing in the world. Okay, I said again, but this time I meant it. I'll try. I don't know how yet, but I'll try. Chris gave me a small smile, the first one I'd seen from him since this conversation began. That's all I need, he said. For a moment, we just sat there, the weight of the conversation settling around us. It wasn't fixed. There were still so many questions, so many things left unsaid. But it felt like a beginning, and that was more than I'd expected when this started. You know, I said after a long pause, my voice lighter now. I never actually thought of you as a side piece. Chris chuckled softly, shaking his head. Good to know, he said, his tone teasing but still tinged with seriousness. I mean it, I insisted, a small smile tugging at my lips. You're a lot more than that, even if I don't always know how to show it. He met my gaze, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a spark of hope in his eyes. We'll figure it out, he said simply. And for the first time, I let myself believe we might. The following days felt like walking a tightrope, balancing between old habits and the promises I'd made. It was strange, really, how easy it was to fall back into patterns of avoidance, to let conversations drift to the surface level where they were safe. But every time I caught myself doing it, I remembered Chris's words. Show up. It was a Saturday afternoon when I decided to take a step forward. We'd spent the morning cleaning the apartment, working in companionable silence. The air between us had been lighter since that night, but there was still a tension, a quiet awareness that we weren't out of the woods. I found him in the kitchen, wiping down the counter with meticulous care. He didn't notice me at first, his focus on the task at hand. It gave me a moment to steel myself, to push down the knot of nerves that had taken up permanent residence in my stomach. "Chris?" I said, my voice softer than I intended. He glanced up, his brow lifting slightly. "Yeah?" I took a deep breath, stepping into the room. "Can we talk for a minute?" Chris set the cloth down, leaning against the counter as he crossed his arms. "Of course," he said, his tone calm but cautious. The words were hard to find, harder to say. "I've been thinking about what you said, about meeting you halfway." I paused, searching his face for a reaction, but his expression remained neutral, waiting. "And you're right. I've been holding back. Not because I don't care, but because I'm scared of what happens if I let myself care too much." He didn't interrupt, just nodded slightly, encouraging me to continue. "I keep thinking about how I joked that you were my side piece," I said, forcing a weak smile that quickly faded. "It was stupid, and I didn't mean it, but I think it says something about how I've been treating this. Like if I keep it casual, I won't get hurt. Like if I don't let myself get too close, I won't have to deal with the fallout if it all goes wrong." Chris tilted his head, his eyes softening. "Maya, I don't need you to be perfect," he said gently. "I just need you to be honest. With me. And with yourself." "I'm trying," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "I swear I'm trying. I don't know if I know how to do this. To let my guard down." Chris took a step closer, his hands resting lightly on the counter behind him. "You just did," he said quietly. I blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "You're letting your guard down right now," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're being honest with me. That's what I've been asking for." The realization hit me like a wave, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. "It doesn't feel like enough," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's a start," he said firmly, "and that's more than enough for me." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult. "You really mean that?" Chris nodded, his gaze steady. "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." A wave of relief washed over me, but it was tempered by the understanding that this was only the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, so many conversations to have. But for the first time, I felt like we were on the same page. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice breaking on the words. Chris stepped closer, reaching out to take my hand in his. "We're in this together, Maya," he said, "no matter how messy it gets." I looked up at him, the sincerity in his eyes making my chest tighten. And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. The following week was a quiet shift in the fabric of our relationship. Nothing dramatic happened. No explosive fights. No tear-filled reconciliations. Instead, it was small moments, barely noticeable to anyone but us. I found myself testing the waters of vulnerability, pushing against the instinct to retreat every time things felt too exposed. One night, after dinner, Chris and I were sitting on the couch, the hum of some random TV show filling the background. I wasn't really paying attention. My mind was elsewhere, running over everything I'd been trying to unpack since that night. The walls I'd built, the excuses I'd made. "Chris," I said, breaking the comfortable silence. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. "Do you ever feel like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop? Like even when things are good, you're just bracing for something to go wrong?" Chris frowned slightly, his gaze thoughtful. I used to, he admitted after a moment. When I was younger, I felt like I couldn't trust anything good to last. Like if I got too comfortable, it would all fall apart. I nodded, my chest tightening. That's how I feel all the time, I said quietly. Like I'm always holding my breath, waiting for everything to go wrong. He didn't respond right away, and I felt a flicker of panic. But then he reached out, his hand resting lightly on mine. I get it, he said softly. But Maya, you can't live your life like that. You'll end up pushing away the things that matter most. I know, I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I know, and I hate that I do it, but I don't know how to stop. It's like I've spent so much time building this armor, and now I don't know how to take it off. Chris's thumb brushed over the back of my hand, a small, comforting gesture that made my throat tighten. You don't have to do it all at once, he said. It's not about tearing everything down overnight. It's about letting someone in, one step at a time. The simplicity of his words made something inside me ache. I want to. I said, my voice trembling. I really do. I'm scared. What if I mess it up? What if I let you in, and you decide I'm not worth it? Chris's hand tightened slightly on mine, and his gaze met mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. Maya, you've got to stop thinking like that. I'm here because I want to be, not because I'm waiting for some perfect version of you to show up. Tears stung the back of my eyes, and I looked away, ashamed of how raw and exposed I felt. But Chris didn't let me retreat. He shifted closer, his voice low but steady. I'm not saying this is easy, he said, for either of us. But if we're going to make this work, we have to trust each other, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult. I'm trying, I whispered. I don't know if it's enough, but I'm trying. Chris's hand moved to my cheek, gently guiding me to look at him. It's enough, he said firmly. You're enough. The tears spilled over then, silent and unstoppable, but for the first time, I didn't feel ashamed of them. I let Chris see me, all of me, and I felt something shift between us. Something fragile, but real. It wasn't a resolution, not exactly. There was still so much left to figure out, so much work to do. But in that moment, I felt a flicker of hope, a quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, we could do this. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. I felt like I was finally learning to exhale. The days that followed felt different, as if a new layer of awareness had settled between us. There was no dramatic shift, no grand declarations, but in the quiet moments, I could feel the change. It was in the way Chris would reach for my hand without thinking, or how I found myself opening up in ways that felt foreign, but necessary. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the apartment in shades of amber, I sat at the kitchen table, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. Chris was in the living room, tinkering with something in his usual meticulous way. I set my phone down and took a deep breath. Chris? He glanced up, his brow lifting slightly. What's up? I hesitated, my heart thudding in my chest. I want to tell you something, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Chris set down whatever he was working on and turned to face me fully, his expression attentive. I'm listening. The vulnerability of the moment felt suffocating, but I pushed through it. I've been thinking about what you said, about trust and letting someone in, and I realized I've spent so much of my life trying to protect myself from getting hurt that I've stopped letting myself really live. Chris didn't say anything, but his eyes softened, and I could see the encouragement in them. I think I've been treating our relationship like it's something I have to keep at arm's length," I continued, my voice wavering. "Not because I don't care, but because I care too much. And that terrifies me." His gaze didn't waver, and the weight of his attention was grounding. "Maya," he said softly, "you don't have to do this alone. Whatever you're feeling, whatever you're afraid of, I'm here. You just have to let me in." Tears welled in my eyes, and I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know how," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I looked up at him, my chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and fear. What if I mess it up? His lips curved into a small, reassuring smile. Then we figure it out together. Relationships aren't about never making mistakes. They're about how we handle them when they happen. The simplicity of his words struck a chord deep within me. It wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about showing up, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. I nodded slowly, a tear slipping down my cheek. "Okay," I said, the word carrying more weight than it ever had before. Chris squeezed my hand, his thumb brushing lightly over my knuckles. "We've got this, Maya. One step at a time." For the first time, I felt a flicker of confidence. Fragile but real. I wasn't fixed, and neither was our relationship, but we were trying. And for the first time, that felt like enough. As the room settled into silence, I realized something important. Trust wasn't a leap of faith. It was a series of small steps, each one building on the last. And in that moment, sitting beside Chris, I felt ready to take the next one. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. The next morning, I woke up before Chris. The sunlight was just beginning to filter through the blinds, casting a soft glow over the room. Chris lay beside me, his face relaxed in sleep, and for a moment I just watched him, my thoughts swirling. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this still, this present. Normally, my mind would be racing, jumping from one worry to the next, but now there was a quietness, a fragile sort of peace that I didn't want to disrupt. Slipping out of bed, I padded into the kitchen and started making coffee. The familiar motions felt grounding, a small ritual to steady myself. As the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, I thought about everything we'd been through in the past few weeks. The tension, the hurt, the small steps toward healing. Chris joined me not long after, his hair tousled and his eyes still heavy with sleep. He paused in the doorway, leaning against the frame as he watched me pour a cup of coffee. "Morning," he said, his voice rough but warm. "Morning," I replied, offering him a small smile. He stepped into the room and reached for a mug, pouring his own coffee before joining me at the table. For a while, we sat in companionable silence, the only sounds the soft clink of our mugs and the hum of the refrigerator. Finally, Chris broke the silence. "You seem different today," he said, his tone curious but gentle. I glanced at him, surprised by the observation. "Different how?" He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Lighter, like something's shifted." I thought about that for a moment, then nodded. "I think it has," I admitted. "I've been so scared of everything falling apart that I forgot to let myself enjoy what we have. But I don't want to do that anymore." Chris's smile widened, and he reached across the table to take my hand. "That's good to hear," he said softly. There was a pause, the kind of comfortable silence that comes when words aren't needed. But then, something bubbled up inside me, something I felt compelled to say. "Chris," I began, my voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in my chest. "I know I've said this before, but I need you to know, you're not my side piece. You're not some afterthought or backup plan. You're everything. And I don't say that enough. Chris's eyes softened and he squeezed my hand. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That means a lot. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep going. I've been so focused on protecting myself that I've been blind to how much I've been hurting you. I can't promise I'll get it right all the time, but I'm going. To try, for you, for us. His gaze held mine, and for a moment, I felt like the rest of the world faded away. That's all I've ever wanted, he said simply. The words settled between us, quiet but profound. It wasn't a grand declaration or a sweeping romantic gesture. It was just us, two people trying to figure it out, one step at a time. As we sat there, the sunlight streaming through the window and the coffee growing cold in our mugs, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time, it didn't feel like we were fighting to keep something alive. It felt like we were building something new, something stronger. And for the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we could make it last. The week that followed was a slow unfolding. It wasn't dramatic or filled with grand gestures, but there was a quiet change in the air. We found ourselves talking more, really talking, about our fears, our hopes, the things that scared us, the things we wanted. It was raw and unpolished, but it was real. One evening, as we sat on the couch after dinner, the conversation turned to something It was a subject I feared more than anything else, but I knew it had to be addressed. Maya, Chris said, his voice hesitant. I've been thinking about the future, about us. I looked over at him, my stomach twisting in a way that felt like both excitement and dread. What about it? He paused, as if carefully weighing his words. I know we've been taking things slow, but I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm in this for the long haul. If you'll have me. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a surge of emotions flood through me. Relief, fear, love, uncertainty. Chris, I started, but the words got stuck in my throat. He smiled softly, his hand brushing against mine. You don't have to say anything right now. I just want you to know where I stand. I'm not asking for anything big. I'm just saying that I'm here. And I want to be here. For as long as you'll let me. The simplicity of his words made my chest ache. It wasn't a proposal, not exactly. But it was something more. A promise. A promise that, despite the messiness and the fear and the history, he was willing to show up. I want that too, I said finally, my voice small but steady. I want us to work. I want us to figure this out. Chris's expression softened, and he reached for my hand, his thumb gently stroking the back of it. Then we'll do it. Together. It wasn't a perfect moment. There was no sudden rush of clarity, no dramatic epiphany. But in that quiet space between us, there was a sense of peace. A sense that, despite everything, we were moving forward. The next day, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led me to this point. Every mistake, every misstep, every fear that had tried to hold me back. I thought about how easy it had been to joke about Chris being my side piece, how easy it was to keep him at arm's length so that I wouldn't get hurt. But now, I couldn't hide behind that anymore. I was learning to be vulnerable, learning that real connection meant showing up, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it meant risking something important. As I sat there in the quiet of the apartment, the weight of everything we'd been through settled over me. But instead of feeling burdened by it, I felt lighter. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. We still had work to do. But for the first time, I felt like we were both ready to walk it together. The thought of that, of facing whatever came next with Chris by my side, filled me with a quiet certainty. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to face it, ready to let someone in, ready to be seen. And for the first time in my life, I truly believed that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't going to mess this up. For the first time, I felt like I was enough, and that was the most freeing feeling of all. If this story resonated with you or brought up any thoughts or emotions, I'd love to hear them. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like you were too afraid to let someone in? What was it like for you to finally open up? Share your thoughts with me. I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspective.